Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. My name is Jeremy Weprich, and I am a student who studies sociology in the College of Arts and Sciences. My project was done under the direction of Professor Ashley Mears, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology. And the title of my project is #No Filter, Virtual Selves and the Use of Deception Online. So I get this question a lot when I tell people that I study sociology. I've been doing that for 4 years now, and my first question is, why would anybody study sociology in the first place? Or why do you study sociology? How did you fall into this? And that's a really good question. And there's kind of this mantra in the Department of Sociology that we go by in a lot of our courses, that sociology gives its students a lens to look at the world, and they find the things that are strange and the most familiar. So finding things that are unexpected and the mundane, things like how we stand in line waiting at a restaurant or how we walk on the side of the street. And sociologists will literally do ethnographies, and they'll study that for years, getting a doctorate in how people walk on the sidewalk, which seems insane. But they'll also go into the craziest of situations, whether it's studying cult religions, new religious movements, or extremist political groups, and find the most relatable, generalizable, universal truths in those kind of extreme situations. So when I was trying to think of a project idea, I wanted to look into, well, what is the familiar for me? What's the strange for me? So I looked into my own everyday life, most of the students in this room, as inspiration for my project. So the everyday life that I was looking around looked a lot like this, and not in necessarily a negative way. The world that I live in, the world that I've grown up with, has a lot of social interaction that looks a lot differently than maybe what my parents went through, and especially the generations before that. This is something that's very familiar to us. So when we're saying something as everyday and what everyday life looks like, as a sociologist, it's impossible to ignore the work of Erving Goffman, who is a seminal sociologist who wrote mostly in the 20th century in what's called symbolic interactionism, which is a school of sociology that explains meaningful social interactions as symbolically being related to each other, that we don't really interact directly with another person, but we interact with the meanings that are put onto the different types of interactions that we have. And Erving Goffman, in his text, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, which was published in 1959, talked about the idea of the world being a stage, this dramaturgical perspective, where the world is a theater, individuals are actors, and that instead of being a true version of yourself, we're actually different performances of ourselves in different situations, that every interaction that we share is a construction of a certain version of ourselves. So he wasn't really interested in finding, a philosophical definition of who the true self was, like a lot of psychologists in social psychology or philosophers are looking for. He thought if the world is social, then the identity, the self, is inherently social, that we are the culmination, the combination of all the different performances that we put on in a given day. And that changes depending on who we're speaking with, where we're speaking, the version of myself I am in front of an audience versus the version of myself that called my mom at midnight last night, the version of myself that's out with my friends. Those are all essentially me, but are very different depending on the audience. And success in socialization occurs when I'm seen the way that I want it to be seen, depending on the role and what I've learned from the meaning of what that interaction should be. So in that way, identity isn't intrinsic to us necessarily in this field of sociology. It's grounded in the social. So what does that mean then when our social world, especially for that of my peers, exists in a virtual space as well as in a face-to-face world? So the everyday life that Goffman talked about is not the everyday life that I'm living, and especially not for my peers and people younger than me. So how can we reimagine Goffman's ideas for a world that is both digital, virtual, and is still unmediated, as in face-to-face interactions still play a general part in our social world? And this is especially true for young people for whom, the internet and social interaction online has been, a primary site for socialization. And now in this setting, when we're talking online, when we're having these mediated types of conversations and interactions, it's this idea of curating a virtual self. So if everything in our life is already a performance, if everything I do face-to-face with you is already a certain construction of myself, then online, I argue that it's even more of a performance. Because of the platforms themselves, the technologies that they allow, like digital photo editing, or the construction of a social profile. When you make a Facebook profile, it asks you, what books do you like to read? What music do you like? There's a conscious choice of what you choose to post and what you choose to not post. This kind of idea, all wrapped up in that, is the idea that we're curating a version of ourselves that exists online that I argue is even more performative than the versions of ourselves that we already perform in everyday life, as Goffman put forward. So this kind of lends me to argue into a more specific point, especially for this project, which had to be a little bit more concise than I usually like to be, to focus in on the idea of deception. And in the title of this project, which starts with the hashtag #NoFilter, that's a common hashtag or virtual tag used in social media like Instagram or on Twitter, where users can add that hashtag to prove that the photo they're posting was unadulterated and unedited in any way, to kind of comment on the authenticity of their post. And if we didn't already understand that there was a degree of inauthenticity inside of this platform, then we wouldn't have to prove that this photo was unedited and that it had some kind of cachet behind it. What's funny is a majority of the posts that have that #NoFilter hashtag are actually edited and filtered. So this is something that I really thought was interesting, and this idea of deceit and deception kept coming up and again as I realized we spend so much time on these social media platforms. And especially for young people, they exist in two main arenas. That's in social networking sites like Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and also in romantic matchmaking and dating websites like Tinder, Grindr, OkCupid. The majority of those that young people use nowadays are actually location-based and exist on a mobile device. That's like Tinder and Grindr, where it can use the app can use the location services built into your phone, so it can find potential matches nearby you by using the GPS inside of your phone system to see who's within a couple miles of you that you could meet up with for a date, depending on what you've set for your criteria for your matches. And as I mentioned before, it's interesting for me to target millennials, the millennial generation that I'm a part of, because we're really the first generation in all of history to grow up with the internet as a primary fundamental site for social interaction, not some kind of secondary place where you can chat alongside what you're doing in already real life. So my general research question is then, how can I understand the conditions under which someone would choose to deceive other people about their virtual identity or their virtual selves in both social networking sites and in romantic matchmaking or dating sites? And my hypothesis, for a variety of reasons, was to first prove that virtual selves are constructed online and that they are constructed in regards to the different types of audiences we have, just as we do in regular face-to-face social interaction. But because of associated status and the inherent technological platforms they're built on, they're even more performative than the lives we already have face-to-face. And that I think young adults would be more likely to deceive each other in romantic dating settings online than they would in regular social networking settings. And the first reason I prove this is through the idea of status, which is something that Goffman also speaks a lot about when defining social classes. And I kind of reappropriate that terminology and that language for the idea of this project. Whereas when we're talking about our virtual selves online in our social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter, we are interacting with a lot of people. So you can be interacting with your parents, your friends, your peers, coworkers, corporations, all different types of small businesses that you have on your social media profiles like Facebook. So in that sense, you have to be a really general and complex at the same time version of your social self, because you have to fulfill the roles that you usually would be fulfilling in much different audiences and much different stages. So online, you have to be yourself, but also still treat all the different audiences that are connecting with you online. And those are still policed by the everyday interactions when you see those people the next day in person. So you have to maybe be a better version of yourself online, but you can't be so wildly different that the people who know you and have known you your whole life, that you see every day in class, wouldn't recognize you in person. So there is still this slight inclination to post favorable content or things that make yourself look a little bit better than you might in everyday life. But especially on dating sites, the status that people are vying for isn't quite as general or as flexible. It's sexual status, and it's largely unmonitored because the interactions are private between you and the potential match. So there isn't anyone checking to make sure that you're, from the outside as a third party, to make sure that you're being honest. And generally they're referencing short-term sexual encounters, which is what young people are using these sites, majority to hook up with other people. They're not trying to find their long-term, future wives or husbands online, as was the case for previous generations using online dating profiles. People our age are using it to find something short term, so there's less risk involved if in real life you realize that that person didn't look exactly the way they did on their profile. So my method was to target undergrads at BU who fall into that category of 18 to 25-year-old millennials, trying to find some links between situational factors and demographic factors that might show a correlation between their propensity to deceive others online. And the results were interesting. I had two main things that really stuck out to me. One was this idea of an attributional bias, that in almost all of my survey respondents, people said that none of the things that would be related to deceiving other people were true of themselves, but were wildly true of everyone else that they knew. So that was interesting because it definitely skews my data for this bias that was self-serving, and I have to use the data that I received to make my conclusions. But it was interesting to see that everyone thought that the propensity to deceive and the likelihood to deceive was pretty much ubiquitous across their own peer group, but that they themselves would never have done that. And also this idea of optimization was really interesting to me, that people in their virtual selves, because of the platform, because of the technology, and because of this, the social status that people are vying for, are likely to improve themselves just a little bit. But if you do it too much, you lose credibility and you lose authenticity. So it's this interesting negotiation between making a better version of yourself, but not so much that you would lose your status in real face-to-face settings. And this is essentially more important for that general social status on Facebook and social media. But on the dating sites, you want to appear more attractive because you're just trying to find that date, and it's less of a risk to meet that person and then they realize you look so ugly compared to your beautiful profile. All you lost was just a date one night. You don't lose the credibility and the trust of the people who are most important to you. So you can see in the graphs here, I asked a variety of questions that I've combined into these graphs that basically ask people, how accurately does your social media profile, your Facebook page, reflect your own physical appearance? On average, people said mostly accurately. There was a mean value of 2.09. But when asking how accurately do other people of your peer groups' social media profiles reflect their appearance, there was about a 0.4 change towards inaccuracy, where people said somewhat accurate. My peers are somewhat accurately representing their physical appearances online, which is not unexpected and definitely not drastic. But we look at those same questions geared towards dating profiles and romantic matchmaking sites. We see the same value for people who are talking about themselves. For their own dating profiles, the same mean value, 2.09. People say, yeah, I'm mostly giving my physical appearance in an appropriate, real way on my dating profile. But other people, almost an entire point shift towards inaccuracy, saying somewhat or not accurately is the way that people portray their physical appearance online through social media, through dating sites as opposed to social media. Which is interesting to me because in the results of other people, of what we believe about other people, it is definitely proving the hypothesis or showing some kind of reassurance that we do believe that other people are more likely to deceive us when we're on a dating website, but also a little bit too in the social media too. But we see that this huge jump that's been negotiated between dating profiles versus social media is something that is clearly shared between almost all of the survey respondents, regardless of gender, race, or sexual orientation. Another interesting thing about the results is that this matching of the hypothesis is definitely more accurate when we look at the dating profiles. The numbers are larger, but still, on average, people felt that their own regular social profiles were slightly more accurate than other people's. But the thing that is confusing about that is that very few respondents actually reported full accuracy of either their social media profiles or of their dating profiles. Only a handful of respondents in the entire pool even added completely accurate for any of those responses, and there were about 30 different questions that I asked. The majority said somewhat or mostly accurate. But in the same vein, the majority of respondents actually admitted to a lot of the different tactics online that I argued were evidence of being deceitful online. About 33% of respondents said that they photoshopped their images to correct physical imperfections. About half of respondents said that they used photo filters, the whole no filter concept, specifically to make themselves look more attractive. That's the reason that they said they used filters. And about 70% of respondents said that they remove unwanted photos that other people post of them on Facebook to make sure that the version of themselves on their profile is the certain curated version of themselves that they think is most appropriate. So even though people are admitting to all these different, what I would argue are deceitful behaviors online, that's not internalized as being a deceitful virtual self. Still, respondents didn't self-identify as being in any way deceitful. So in that way, it points to that there's this understood level of inauthenticity or deceit that's embedded in this online culture. But for young adults who are mediating it between their face-to-face interactions of the people who are liking your posts, who are commenting on your posts, are the people you know in real life, it's interesting to see that people kind of agree upon this general understood notion that there's something inauthentic about the selves that we present online. So what this kind of shows us is that the virtual world is a stage, just like Goffman set forth, for different types of performances that I argue are perhaps a little bit more carefully constructed and more carefully monitored than the face-to-face settings that we have, because the technologies and the platforms kind of allow for that behavior. So in conclusion, Goffman's conceptual framework, I argue, is a really great way to kind of look at the world as it is today, even though he was publishing things in the 50s and 60s, and he specifically said outright that the technologies that we're picking up in that time would fail completely. He argued that telephones and any kind of mediated interaction would never work, because we would never know the real, what people were really trying to tell us. We couldn't read their facial expressions. There's no way we'd ever be able to communicate with anything but face-to-face. And that's what a lot of his work was used in his time to defend. But it's interesting to use those frameworks, those themes that he gave us, to reimagine what it looks like in a world where we clearly are successfully interacting online. And especially for young people who are less likely to report about themselves, still this idea of expression and performance and deceit is there, and it's proliferating, and is especially true on dating platforms. So these digital technologies, the curation-based platforms, and also a widened social audience that is vying for different types of status makes and exacerbates the idea that we're performing in our social interactions, whether they're face-to-face or online. Thank you, guys.